So I have to say that I have no idea what I'm getting into, but let this serve as warning. Don't be the one who answers the phone when Stu calls. I appreciate, actually somebody asked me last night, I think they said it more politely than what the hell, but generally the concept was, so why are you doing this? Why are you taking this on? And first of all, I have to say that the leadership that Stuart and Bob have shown so far has been tremendous and exciting, and made it easy for me to say, sure, I'll do what I can to help. But second of all, as I was reflecting on this, I said at the beginning of this 3 weeks ago when this meeting started, it seems like, that this is really important, and it's really important to AARP, but it's not the center of our job. It's how we work, but it's not what we work on. And as I was talking to people around the room, civic engagement is critical to how we can be successful. But to date, it's nobody's main job. And I think that's what the Florida Civic Advance needs to be about. It needs to be about pulling the threads together of all the different organizations who rely on a strong civic culture in order to be successful, and figure out how we can make it more successful, how we can make civic engagement much better here in Florida, recognizing that for all of us who rely on strong, we all rely on good roads, but we have a transportation department. We rely on a strong civic culture, but we don't have a civic culture department. And so we need to build that together. And that's exciting from the point of collaboration and the value of collaboration. And so I look forward to continuing to work with the folks here in this room, as well as the ones who have fled screaming. As part of the process, I think there were about 16 or 20 at the beginning, propositions of different areas we might work on, and then a couple of years ago it was refined down to 8. And you've just seen the great work of a lot of folks on 4. That leaves 4. And if you've got, I'm sure everybody still has their packet fully intact, there's one black and white sheet that has the listing of my new 50 best friends on the front. But in the back are the listing of all 8 of the practice areas and what we hope to get to in each of those. And this is our, bless you, this is our coming attraction for the 4 to come. And so we'll be using this opportunity to just kind of tee up what those issues are, maybe have some brief conversation, recognizing folks are eager to get on the road. And then moving forward, we'll be working with Bob and with Stuart, who is not actually leaving completely yet, at least that's what he told me, to figure out how we begin to move forward. And so I want to start, particularly given that it is an election day in many parts of our state, by talking about voting and voter education. And Mindy, would you mind leading us through your thoughts on that?
Okay. Last panel of the last day. So that means we have to be really good to make it worth your while staying, right? Although the presentation of that really pretty award, that was pretty nice. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about voting and voter participation. And as you can see, the title of my research center is California Civic Engagement Project. We do research on civic engagement issues more broadly, but we do a lot of work on voting behavior. I've been asked to address a few questions around it, so I've kind of organized my talk around those questions. So first off, why is voting important? It's important, right? But why is it important? Sometimes we hear, well, it's our civic duty. Beyond the idea of your civic duty, how does it tangibly matter to people, to the individual, to communities? How do we sell that? Well, first, I'm going to run you through some numbers to make sure we're kind of all on the same page. Some numbers I think maybe some of you may be aware of, but maybe some of you may not be aware of. Just what is the state of voter engagement in our country and in Florida? So I'll give you some Florida numbers too. But first, talking about why it matters before I give you some of those numbers. So beyond civic duty, there is just the idea of representation, right? One person, one vote. We should all be, voting is just one element of civic engagement, but a very critical element of civic engagement. People, an individual, you, right, should express yourself through your vote. your policy preferences. Hopefully it's an informed vote. You're selecting the person or individuals that are going to be representing you in various different capacities. There's that connection to a broader form of civic engagement. We used to think, well, voting was the simplest step up to be engaged, and if you vote, then you're more likely to do other forms of engagement. That actually is less clear now, particularly amongst young people. There are a lot of young people that are very active and engaged in different ways in their communities, but they don't vote, or they don't see the value of voting. And I'll talk in a little bit why that is. It's not because they don't care. And bottom line is who you pick, the individuals you pick to represent you in your communities are making policy decisions that affect you, your pocketbook, your greater community, the quality of life in your communities. And because there are patterns to engagement, and I'm going to show you some numbers that aren't so great in terms of disparities, but because it isn't just that you are individually more or less likely to vote, but whole communities are more or less likely to vote. Communities of color, low-income communities, the youth community, period, right, have lower turnout numbers. And that means that you end up having whole communities across your state, across our country, certainly in my state, that are underrepresented electorally. Make sense? They have less of a say in those policy decisions that have a direct output, right, outcome or effect on the outcomes that matter to them in terms of quality of life, economic, unemployment rates, quality of their schools, the list goes on and on. So voting matters to the quality of life, the well-being in communities. Okay, I'm assuming that's not something I have to sell, but let's get it on for the record. So what is the state of voting? So overall, it's not that great. I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, but if you compare us internationally, amongst established democracies across the world, we are consistently one of the lowest, right? So as one of the speakers said earlier today, actually our keynote last night talked about us being kind of the greatest democracy. Well, if you look at our voting numbers, one measure of engagement, but again, a critical one, we are doing very poorly, right, compared to the rest of the world. So in 2016, the general election, presidential year, that's usually as good as we get in terms of turnout, right? 61% turnout of those that are eligible, that's adult citizens, whether registered or not. If you're curious, and I think everybody in this room would agree, no matter what your politics, it was a consequential election, right? I'm going to step back a little bit from this. For the total eligible turnout rate, about flat from 2012. Whites, a little bit less. African Americans significantly less, 7 percentage points less than 2012. Asian Americans a little bit better. Latinos about flat nationally. Where does that mean? How do you place that into context? This is a really busy chart, but I just want to show you. This is midterms and these are all presidential, but going across time since 1980. And you can see one thing is we don't really deviate a whole lot, right? The purple line is that total eligible turnout rate. The other colors are other racial and ethnic groups. Two things that you can get from this. One is we have highs and lows, but the difference is only really a few percentage points. So a good year is not that big of a difference from a bad year, right? A little depressing. And that disparities by race, ethnicity, so if you can't see in the back, white is blue, white non-Latino, white non-Hispanic is blue, African American is orange, Latino is red, Asian American is green. You see much lower turnout for nearly every group. There's some exceptions here for African Americans for 2008 and 2012. And then, you see that story of disparity, period. And I could show you that for young people too. So what about Florida? You want to see some of your own numbers for Florida? What do you think, better or not as good as the national numbers? Not as good? So total, 2016, same election, comparable, 59.5, a little bit lower than the national. However, I did rank you guys, and it is in the bottom 25%. So we've got states like California, which also consistently have really low numbers, right, that kind of affect the national total number. Does that make sense? But in terms of just if you were to rank on a scale, and California is actually lower than Florida. Florida fell in the 2016 election in the bottom quarter of all states. Make sense? Okay. Disparities shouldn't be a surprise, but African Americans much lower, bigger gap there. Asian American 40%, Latino 54%. Let me show you just briefly over time. So again, same kind of story here. We're just only looking at from 2000 to 2016. Disparities consistent over time. One thing that really stands out, a lot of things stand out, but one thing I'll point out to you is the Latino vote, which is a large segment of your population. In 2012, here Latinos red, right? What happened in 2012? Higher than whites. Never seen anything close to that in California or in any other large state. 2012, Latinos did better than whites. There's always a significant gap. Historically, there's a gap in your state as well. 2016, yes, in the Trump election. Oh, so sorry. I don't know why that's doing that to me. In the Trump election, with a lot of expectation around the Latino vote in the state, as we did in our own state, but particularly in Florida, right? Latinos significantly declined, an 8 percentage point, which is huge in a presidential election for a large state and a large Latino population. 8 percentage point decline in turnout. Whites increased about 1.5%. Clear on that? African Americans also again decreased as they did nationally. Asian Americans also decreased. So everybody decreased except for whites. Now there were pockets of high turnout for Latinos, of course. Miami-Dade had some successes, as we know. Other areas where whites, it turned out even higher, right? Kind of reversed some trends, things like that. But I'm talking about at the state level. And then in terms of representation, one of the things I always talk about is, does a group's percent of the vote, so because of disparities, groups have different shares of the vote, like the pie of actual voters. What is that group's share of the actual voters in an election, whether it's high or low turnout? Does it match about their share of the eligible voter population? If it's about the same, it means they're numerically represented, right? Latinos in my state, because of disparities, are always much smaller share of the vote in any election than they are the share of the eligible voter population. Look for Latinos in 2012, because they outpaced whites. They actually, if you can see, the green line is share of voters in an election. The red line is share of eligible voters. Latinos are actually slightly more represented amongst voters than they were amongst eligible voter population, right? The power of turnout. 2016 went down again by a little bit. When I see young people, since we've been talking about young people so much today, I'm going to ask you a question. What do you think the eligible turnout rate, this is for citizens, right, whether registered or not, was in 2016, in the general, in November? 35. You just have this.
Too low.
Too low. How low? Stake a number, huh?
18%.
18%. Anyone else? 22. We were joking around, but it's not a joking matter, right? 22? Want to see? Well, but remember, you were at 59% for everybody, right? So almost, well, actually over a 20 percentage point gap. When we look at midterm elections, when we look at local elections, you're talking 30, 40, sometimes greater gap between the general and young people. You break this out and take young people out of the equation, even bigger gap. Yeah. Sorry? Oh, sorry. Age 18 to 24 here. But if you look at, if you take out of the general, you take young people out of the general and just looking at young versus older, much bigger gap, right? But in the midterm election in 2014, 17% was your eligible church. So you were really close if we were looking at midterms. Yeah, I knew that's what you meant. So 20 percentage points lower in your 2014 midterm election. What are you going to, now upcoming is a midterm election. Those of you that work with young people, you know, we know that historically very low. Okay. Demographic change, I'm just going to talk really quickly here because we were talking about numbers last night, and demography is not destiny, political destiny. I've done some work around that, and I have some thoughts of my own there. But what I'll just say here for today is if you look at the entire U.S. population, Latinos are 17%, whites 62%, 12% African American, 5% Asian American. This is the whole population, whether they're a citizen or not. In my state, Latinos are 39%. A couple of years ago, for the first time, surpassed whites, so they're the plurality of the population. Do you know what it is? Do you remember actually our keynote speaker mentioned the number last night? What percentage of the population is Latino in Florida? Anybody remember? This is a quiz for your keynote. 40%. 40%? I'm going to tell her. Oh, actually, well, here, I'll show you first. And then I'll go back. 24%. So the entire population, young and old, citizen or non, 24%. Your eligible voter population, adult citizens, Latinos are just under 20%. Okay? And in case you're curious where we're heading, so this is Latinos are 17%, African Americans 13%, Asian Americans 5%, right? 2014. The US Census has projected out population over the next 30 or so years. So you can see 2015, if we just look Latinos because that's where the driving change is, right, in growth. 17% in 2015, 28% for the US as a whole in 2060. I don't have projections for Florida, so my apologies. So I showed you this. So let's talk about things we should be talking about and paying attention to change some of these numbers, particularly for young people and young people of color. That 37% and that 17% that I gave you for the youth vote for 18 to 24, much lower for youth of color, much lower for low-income youth. So it gets much worse than that. When I think about increasing turnout, I think about it in two ways. There's a long list, and I'll show you in a moment, but really you can break it down. Two driving things. We need to make it easier for people to vote, right, particularly young people, and we need to make them want to vote. The making it easier is those access questions, right, institutional barriers like registration, how we set up our electoral system, and then making them want to vote, that's the attitudinal, but often I think that's much harder, people feeling disconnected from the political process, right? They may have access to information, they may be registered, they may have even voted in the past, but do I want to participate in this system? Do I feel it's worth my time? Do I feel my vote matters? That sort of thing. So just really quickly, because of time, some of the obstacles, this is really a laundry list, but electoral context matters. So in 2014 in my state, we had a record low turnout rate. Only 31% of everybody, eligible or otherwise, voted. Young people age 18 to 24, only 8% voted. Why? A lot of factors in the context of that election that caused, we think, that record low turnout. Every election has its own context, right? Popular candidates, lame ducks, competitive race, not competitive race, money, not money in the race. Institutional barriers are always at place, particularly for young people around registration. Registration is tied to an address. Young people are mobile. Young people are not taught in our schools the how, what, and why around voting, right? How do you actually register? How do you actually vote? How do you get information? Let's walk you through it. It's a very, intimidating process for young people. Lack of outreach. So we know that a huge factor across the board, when we're looking at disparities in turnout, for those of color, for young people, you name it, groups that have historically low turnout rates are the groups that also historically get much less outreach and education and mobilization that we all need. Believe it or not, you hate those flyers in the mail reminding you to vote, you need them, right? And young people get very little of it because they're seen as not likely voters in our likely voter model, the way our machine works. It's that candidates and campaigns are the ones that are primarily responsible for the outreach in our society. Wonderful nonprofits that do that work, but you're fighting an uphill battle, and the candidates and campaigns are the ones that usually have the ability to reach out to everyone, and they're not reaching out to everybody. They're just reaching out to, of course, those that they think are likely voters for them. But young people get very little outreach and mobilization, and then the vicious cycle continues in terms of that low turnout. And then I'll just skip over here because of time on apathy. I want to mention this for young people. Young people particularly, and I think this is across the board really to some degree for all historically underrepresented groups, but young people get this label of apathetic. You see those numbers and you hear, what's wrong with young people today? Oh, those kids, they just don't care, right? I argue there's always apathetic voters in any group, but for most part, young people care very, very much. They don't see what the connection is often for voting. They either feel intimidated, they don't have the information they need, or they also feel like, I'm going to spend my time doing X, Y, Z over, working in the park or joining an organization, volunteering my time, whatever it might be, but I don't see how voting is an actionable step on something I care about. And overall in our society, we expect young people to turn 18 and automatically, magically know how to vote, and we give them no support in doing that. So I do try to fight the narrative whenever I hear somebody trying to blame, and sometimes we just do it and we're not even thinking, right? We care about young people, we're working on behalf and with young people, and we still might sometimes promote that narrative and blaming young people. And we have to fight that at every turn. We really, really do. Because then it makes it completely socially acceptable for young people not to vote and for us to not support them. Okay. So in the end, only those that are likely to vote are the ones that vote. How do we build coalitions? Just I think my last slide here. Equitable civics education. You all have been talking about that today, but it's really critical that it's equitable. So that it isn't, which is still great to see, but it isn't just the cool teacher or the really dedicated principal or the great community group that comes in and wants to work with the school, right? Because we know from across the country, generally speaking, it's the communities that get that extra hand, right, are the ones that are going to be wider and more wealthier. So equitable, across the board. And when we have them in schools, it's equitable in terms of accessing and being accessible to all kids in schools, not just those that are seen as leaders, as we define them. Culturally relevant expressions of engagement, what does that mean? It means, like, broader than voting. It means that when we talk about engaging people, we think about where they're at, kind of the last step here. So Robert's Rules of Order, what the heck is that? For many of us, right, that can be intimidating, but for many communities, it can be an extreme barrier, right, to participate in our government process. Outreach by all sectors, so I always say, especially particularly for young people, for communities that care, it should be 360. It should be businesses, which I know you're all talking about today. It should be nonprofits, it should be churches. It's not just the schools, certainly, even though we need more with the schools. It should be all segments in a community that are coming together to promote engagement. I know you're all talking about that, and that's exactly what this network is all about, but just mentioning it here. And accessible government structures along the lines of what I mentioned a moment ago. So meeting people where they're at, flipping our systems, right, or opening up our systems in ways that understand, that make it relevant for people, to make it real and relevant and accessible, as opposed to expecting or teaching people to try to access the systems where they're at. Oh, and then lastly, long game. So when we're talking about civic engagement, often what happens is we talk about civic engagement here, and we talk about voting over here, and voting's talked on the election cycle, right? 6 months, 3 months, 1 month, you start seeing activity in a community. And that just doesn't cut it. That's what gives us 61% or 55% or 30% turnout rate. We need to be talking about these things as interconnected. We need to move beyond the election cycle. We need to, right after the election cycle, we need to be connecting the issues that young people care about, that people care about, the spectrum of engagement that we want people to be involved in, and also saying, what about voting? You know, are you registered? Let me talk about these issues that we've been working on 24/7 together passionately. Let me also talk about how voting is a critical step in getting that done, right? And many nonprofits and many folks may not see that connection, or may be fearful of that connection, or maybe their funders don't want them to talk about that connection. There's all kinds of barriers why. But if we want to really move the needle on these numbers, and particularly in disparities, we're going to have to do that. We need to translate that other forms of engagement to the ballot box, and we need to start now, again, not just as the election nears. And that's it. Thank you.
So in a lot of the documents that you've received from FCA, it mentions that we're 50th for volunteerism, we're 44th for charitable giving, and then in terms of the data that we've compiled, we're 40th in the country for assets per capita for this sector. And so even though that sounds dreadful, for me, it's an opportunity that there only is one way to go, and that's up. So that's a positive piece to start with. Florida Philanthropic Network did an economic snapshot of the nonprofit sector a decade ago, and so from where we were then to now, the sector has grown tremendously. In terms of numbers, the number of nonprofits has increased from 46,000 to now 83,000 that are registered. In terms of employment, we've grown our workforce from 380,000 to now 530,000. And so if you keep that in mind, we did have a recession, and the sector still surpassed and prevailed during that moment. So I just want to start with the positivity. The economic impact report that I'm referencing, you can find it on our website, flnonprofits.org. So if you go on economic impact and click data dashboard, you have the ability to see the data for your county, for your region, or the state. And the regions mimic the Department of Economic Opportunity, so we're not recreating the boundaries that already exist. Why that's relevant is because it allows you to see the social functions within the nonprofit sector that are present in your community, everything from arts to health to education, to really be able to see the number of those nonprofits within that area. The piece that's really critical for capacity of those nonprofits is their resources by assets per capita. So you'll quickly see that arts and culture might have significantly lower dollars available than health, for example. So that really allows us to see where some of the greater needs are, but also who's present in that community and who can we reach out to and what can we work on together. In terms of the growth rate for the state, so one of the key pieces, and the gentleman, when you guys were doing the roundtables earlier, mentioned that our numbers come from migration. They don't come from birth rate. And so one of the challenges that the sector faces is oftentimes we are waiting for volunteers to come to us, or we're using the traditional methods to reach them. But we aren't really going where they are. And so, Villages Community is a great example. There's a whole subdivision that's popped up that didn't exist years ago. And now there's everything from healthcare facilities to restaurants to just leisure activities that are present for them. But they still don't know the footprint of the sector within their neighboring counties, where the need is, et cetera. And so we have to figure out a way to reach those communities where they are without making it feel like we're taking away their retirement, quote unquote, from them. The other piece that I wanted to mention is the trust that we do have from the community. So Independent Sector did a research data study 2016 that really looked at how the voters see us versus the federal government. And over 78% trust the nonprofit sector over the federal government with their paycheck. They expect the federal government to work in collaboration with the sector for more efficient solutions to the problems that exist. So that also is a glimmer of hope that really average citizens are looking to us to help formulate solutions and guide solutions in respect to what's happening. And that's something to keep in mind, because I don't think we often remember that we are more powerful than oftentimes it feels like when we look at our counterparts in the business and government sector. And then strategies of how we're looking for outreach. As Mindy mentioned, generational shifts are occurring, and where capacity and bandwidth are issues. So we can't utilize the most effective storytelling tools that exist out there, or we might not have the capacity for one staff member to do additional pieces. So how can we leverage the business community who does have those resources, who does have those individuals that can provide that? So, looking at that contribution aside from just a financial contribution. JP Morgan Chase is a great example of this. They lend out their employees for these campaigns to figure out how can you collectively come up with solutions for nonprofits besides just funding. Sometimes, even if we get the funding, we still have to figure out how to create what we're trying to solve. The handout that you'll get in a short while, I believe, after, so similarities in terms of the for-profit climate and the nonprofit climate. Some of the similar challenges we're facing are leadership and talent, succession planning. For-profits definitely have a better way of looking long-term in terms of when a CEO is retiring, board involvement in that process. But nonprofits in our state and across the country are going to be seeing a wave of retirements, but we aren't fully equipped for that piece in terms of how are we training the incoming CEOs, what kind of benchmarks, maps exist within organizations so that someone else can pick up where the last person left off. How are we sharing best practices, relationships within the community? And these are some of the things that are critical for the sector, especially when we're looking at cultivating the next generation of leadership. And this is where we lag behind our business partners. Outdated, uninformed government regulations. This is something that both business and for-profit sectors face, and it's really just looking at the regulatory reform efforts at the state and the federal level to identify regulations that make good sense and should be preserved. So on the state level, we have a partnership with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and it's called the Florida Charitable Advisory Partnership. That includes FNA, FPN, United Way of Florida, Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Department of State, Department of Finance, and the Attorney General's Office, with the goal of really reviewing any changes that will affect the sector in terms of language, in terms of rollout, in terms of feedback, so that we are at the table processing that information rather than just being given that information. And that's proved to be really valuable with things like multi-state investigations. Sunshine previously prevented us from doing that, but now with what's been happening with online giving campaigns, especially after Pulse, we were able to create a MOU that allowed states to share information and go after those individuals that were utilizing that platform to raise funds, saying that's going back to the community, but really it was going into their pocket where they are in Mississippi, et cetera. So that's something that has been in the works for the past 4 years, and we're really excited that the state departments and agencies that are a part of this were thrilled to be on board with this. The other issue that's coming up and has been in the works is growing commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity. So what is the makeup of the CEOs in the nonprofit sector? How are we incorporating the communities that we're serving in our leadership, in our staff, to ensure that we are including all Floridians in that framework? Advocacy. So this is something we're certainly more passionate about than most, but it's really core to any organization and really educating nonprofits to be better advocates. Jack talks about this all the time as well. And individuals often believe that nonprofits can't lobby, nonprofits can't advocate, and there is a IRS regulation and requirement of how much you can do, but that doesn't mean you can't at all. And so we're oftentimes not even part of the conversation because we are fearful of what that would mean, and we don't participate, and as a result, we get left out. So that's one of the challenges as well. Differences. How our impact is measured is huge for us because we're often given a year to show great impact on grants and funding, whereas a project usually takes a year to 3 years in terms of how it's been able to relate to the community feedback and revise the impact accordingly. And so this presents great opportunity for partnerships with businesses because of their expertise around data analysis. So how can we improve our benchmarks and metrics better? How can we utilize better the data better? And how can we look at technology that exists so that we're able to do this without a lot of staff and manpower? Costs, a key determinant of any success for any organization. And it's not so much a trend, but a reality for charitable nonprofits and organizations. Indirect costs. This is something that we often don't get a lot of credit for, where it's often seen as wasteful, but in reality, we have to pay the rent, we have to pay electricity bills, and we have to figure out how to do it with restricted funding. And so that's a conversation that we're always having in the community because our funders and our business partners can help with that once they see the value in those pieces, and a healthy number, a low percentage that goes towards overhead versus being alert that too low is actually a red flag. Will this nonprofit even exist in 2 to 3 months? And so having those honest, transparent conversations rather than being afraid to because of the funder-grantee dynamic. And lastly, if you've been following the tax reform bill that came out last week, the charitable deduction is a whole other piece that I won't get into, but the Johnson Amendment. So this is something that we are really fearful of because we don't want to be in the business of the Democratic Breast Cancer Organization versus the Republican Breast Cancer Organization. So those of you that are not familiar with the Johnson Amendment, it was something that was passed in the 60s that really kept nonprofits out of partisan politics. We could not endorse a candidate, we could not fundraise for a candidate, and so therefore, we're just serving the constituents in our communities. However, now this bill is looking to be laxed based on the framework that's come out, which means that the IRS was told not to really go after anyone that does push these boundaries, but also looking at relaxing these boundaries, especially for houses of worship. Why that's dangerous is if anybody with a 501c3 status has this, then you could have a board member that comes to you and say, my friend's running for XYZ office, we should support them. And that's just going to put us in a tough situation. So we've been really encouraging nonprofit boards to come up with a policy and figure out how are you going to address this should this come to you before it gets there, so you have a candid discussion with your board members and donors and are not put in that awkward place of choosing for your budget versus your ethics. So those are some of the things that have come up, and I just wanted to share that briefly. If you have any questions, you can go to flnonprofits.org. And my email address is at the bottom of this sheet. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabine. And as we go forward, we're going to be evaluating what's gone on so far in the first round, and before we set a course for how we push forward. But obviously, there's a lot of work to do, a lot of opportunities for growth in both the nonprofit and voting. One of the things that's hardest to measure in some ways, but as I understand it, was perhaps central to the founding of the Florida Civic Advance, is politeness, niceness, neighborliness. And that's something that shows up in civic health in measures around how well you know your neighbor, or go eat at a neighbor's house, those sorts of things. But it's something that as policy people, we're not used to being engaged in or involved in. And so that's an area where I think we're gonna have to be particularly creative in figuring out what the role of Florida Civic Advance is. And so thankful that Daniel, I don't know if Stu called you and you answered the phone, kind of like that happened with me, but I appreciate you taking on the leadership and just framing this issue for us today. Do you mind taking it away? And I think there's a polite request that you come to the podium to deliver that.
Oh, I'm going to politely decline, though, because and that's how this works. That's civics. You guys can see me and hear me, right? All right, I just have things spread out here, so I just want to make sure that I say what I want to say, and I'm going to try to keep this really brief. First of all, I want to thank Bob for actually asking Allegheny and myself to participate in this. In no way do I think that we are an expert in civic neighborhood engagement. We are not a engager of policies, and we're not an organizer of communities. But I think your reasoning behind that is the recent Common Good initiative that we started 2.5 years ago, where we wanted to go into specific communities, impoverished communities, disenfranchised communities, in very specific areas throughout Florida, and we wanted to start to engage with those communities and help those neighborhoods have their voices be heard. Because what we had learned through a survey process was that many of these communities, one of their biggest concerns, when we went into the communities, we said, what do you need? What are you looking for? We thought the answer would be more services, but in every community, some form of ability to advocate for themselves was something that we heard. And so we have an initiative called the Common Good Initiative that is now working in 3 communities. In the Miami area, we're in Overtown, which is a historic African-American community that has a long, rich history that I won't get into. If you want to hear about Overtown's history, you can definitely come up and have a conversation with me. But needless to say, it is a community that was once thriving, is no longer thriving, and due to gentrification is on the very edge of disappearing, literally off the map. When you look at new maps of Miami, the city of Miami, the neighborhood of Overtown is no longer even included. So this is an issue that is really important to us, important to me, and I was asked to sort of respond to 3 questions. One was, why is this an important issue to engage our neighborhoods? And then what is some of the pressing or priority points around this? And finally, what role can FCA play? And so I'll be brief in my responses to that. First, why is this an important issue? I think throughout the last 2 days, a common theme that we can probably take from every civic issue that we've talked about is the lack of engagement for certain communities, whether it be the millennials or the African American community. And I believe that, and this is me talking based off of interviews and relationships that I've been able to form through the work that I do, I believe that people stop, I'm not going to say caring, because Mindy said it's not about caring, but they stop listening. They stop trying to understand systems that they believe no longer care or listen to them. And so if we do not create a format, a process in which communities that we want to see civic improvements, civic engagement improvements in, we must first make sure that they feel that they are heard, that they are understood, and they are valued. So that has been our overarching observation and feedback that we've got. And with this initiative, we're hoping to create different resources and opportunities for those individuals to start to not just have their voices heard, but listened to and responded to. I thought Donovan's example earlier today with the park, which is right down the street from where I live in Miami, was a perfect example of a park that was in disrepair and underutilized for many, many years. But once the community was actually able to say, hey, we want to make a change. And by the way, don't bring your people in to do it. We want to do it. In fact, he said 74% of those people wanted to do the change, and they did it, and they reclaimed that park. And that's just a basic example, but I think there are many ways to engage our communities and to allow them to have an equal voice at the table. Not just a vote, but an equal voice and an equal hand. Someone once taught me that, it's so interesting that individuals go into communities and try to change communities and be the savior to those communities. But the truth is that activity of providing that service and being that savior, for lack of a better word, is where all of the power is. And so our responsibility is no longer to come into communities and to be their saviors, but to invest in those communities and allow them. We don't even empower them. We allow them to empower themselves. We give them the resources, the education, and the tools to empower themselves so they can be the solution. And I just feel that is something that's really important to the Common Good Initiative and all the work that we're doing as we strategize on how to engage the different sectors and different communities that we feel are right now disengaged. What are the priority attention points for this? I think there's a lot. The first one I mentioned is investing in leaders. So with the Common Good Initiative, we are going into our 3 communities, and we're finding both natural leaders, leaders who are already engaged in the community, but also individuals who have the potential of being leaders but have not had the opportunity. We've recently elected 5 fellows from each of those communities, so a collection of 15. And when you look at each of those leaders or potential leaders, they run the gamut of professions, of race, of age, of gender. And I think it's really important that they will start to learn from one another. And there's so much information I could give, but I'm not going to bore you because it is 3:30, last panel of a very, very long 2 days. But the one point I will say with this process is we have our own, and when I say we, the process for the Common Good Initiative, utilizing a group of local stakeholders, we have our own goals. We have our own desires of what the vision of Overtown will look like at the end of 7 years. And it was really important to us with this fellowship that even with this fellowship, though we also are funding that and it's part of this initiative, that we didn't have those fellows attached to those goals. And so one of the strategies, and I mention this just to say that we don't want to pollute and bring our agenda to the table. So when we selected those 5 fellows, people said, well, how are they going to help you achieve your goals? And I said, they might not. They might have a goal that's totally different than the 5 or 6 things that we are currently working on, and that's okay. That's important for us to also support that. So that goes to one of my other recommendations, is that we as professionals have to learn how to enter communities, how to enter the room, and to leave our agenda at the door. I don't think we all have agendas. We all have missions. We all have reasons for being at the table. And I think we have to allow that to inform the work that we do. But at some point, we have to put that down and allow others in the room to be heard. And I find so often in the work that we do that our professional disciplines either aren't comfortable with that, aren't willing to believe that there is talent, untapped talent in the communities that we are saying are disengaged, that we need to go and we need to mentor them and we need to show them how to do, versus accepting them for who they are, where they are, how they are, and allowing them to have a seat at the table in order to be a trusted member of that. And then finally, I believe that as we approach communities, in order to allow a neighborhood to be part of the solution, we have to be looking at a way to develop trust with them, but then also allow the power differential to be addressed, in that they bring something to the table, they bring their perspective, they bring their reality, they bring their ideas, and then we have to figure out what then do we contribute, right? So I'm Allegheny Franciscan Ministries, and I have a 20-year history in this organization, and everybody loves us and opens their doors to us. What can I provide then if I'm no longer the sole bearer of great ideas, right? So you're bringing your ideas. Well, guess what? I still have connections, and I have the ability to open doors for that community. So I think it takes us reframing our roles as a funder, as elected officials, as whatever our disciplines are in this room. I think each and every one of us, if we truly want to be part of the movement towards engaging these disengaged communities, these neighborhoods, and having them feel welcome to the table, it's going to require us also to reframe who we are. And that's kind of a heady topic, and I'm willing to take a couple questions about it if people want to go there. But I'm just going to say that and let you know that for me, as someone who's been doing this for 15 years, I'm learning every day. I'm learning to walk into the room and not have the answer. I really appreciated the mayor's advice of being the consensus builder, right? And not necessarily being the expert. Even if you have the idea, tuck that idea away here, and sometimes you walk out of the room with a different opinion or idea. And I think that's difficult for us, especially those who have been doing this for a while. And I think it is probably the biggest skill set that is needed in order to be more effective at engaging. And then finally, what should FCA do? I think there's a lot that FCA can and should do, but one of my first recommendations is that we have to get out of this room. We have to get out of talking to one another. And as much as I love seeing each of your very beautiful faces, we have to mix it up. And if we truly want to start to engage our neighborhoods and let them feel that they are heard, we have to invite them to the table. We have to go and meet them where they are. And I think we also need to look at the format. This 2-day process, and it's been a wonderful experience, but we have to break the academic model. If we truly want to hear from these neighborhoods, these disenfranchised neighborhoods, these neighborhoods that currently aren't engaged, we have to break the model. I will say this because they're not here, but I was eavesdropping, listening to 2 young ladies who were participating. I guess they're going to some university that is engaged in here, and they were talking about their level of engagement at this event, and they were telling whoever was on the phone that they kept ducking out. We keep leaving, but we keep showing up because we don't want to get in trouble. But the truth is, we weren't speaking to them. We have an audience. We had an opportunity to have this young voice into this room, but they weren't part of the discussion. Whether we invited them to the room, that's not enough. If we're going to invite them to the room, we have to make them part of the discussion. And that is part of the message that I give you with reaching out to our neighborhoods. If it's not enough to go into the neighborhoods, it's not enough to give them the format to respond to a blog, but they have to be heard, and you have to be able to allow that to be real to them. And then the last thing I will say is, Eric Hodges earlier, he talked about the Big Brothers, Big Sisters study, and he was able to show that for those communities where you took those individuals and you had them either engaged in Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or they weren't, and you had the control group, and those who were engaged outperformed the others. And I would venture to say that if you could do a similar study for these communities, these neighborhoods that we want to engage with, you would see similar outcomes if you truly could have communities where people are going in and engaging and providing not just the support, but the opportunity for empowerment and for perseverance. I believe you would also see those communities would start to be more civically engaged and would start to be, I think, reaching towards the goals that we're all striving to see in our communities. So that's all I got for now. So.
Thank you, Daniel. Great fodder, great prophetic voice. And we are going to close it. First of all, I want to thank those of you who've made it all the way through and apologize for the rumor that there's a drawing for a free car at the end. But clearly you know that we have saved the best for last. One of the best synthetic thinkers in the state. I know he has been taking notes throughout.
I thought I was going to speak, not Daniel.
Oh, shoot. Okay, so instead we're going to have Tony. I know he's been taking notes throughout, and he and I have an agreement that no matter what question I ask him, he's still going to say whatever he wants. So why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Thank you very much, and thanks for allowing me to be here. And Daniel, thank you so much for recognizing that audiences have to be engaged in this process. I'm going to be speaking about economic development, and all too often in a room like this and too many of the other events that I go to, I'm the only voice of business or the person that is representing business. And it's an interesting seat to sit in. I'm going to talk about the importance of economic development on this. It was appropriate that I go last to some degree in this process because business and economic development is sometimes viewed as an end. But it's also a means to the civic engagement. I'm going to cover a few different items. The first is what we give. The second is what we get. Talk about a natural experiment that we're observing and how it ties into this. Review economic development and demographics, and then talk about collaboration. If there's time, and because I didn't set my clock back for daylight savings, I got a whole hour, so I don't care about you guys. That is not true. I do want to ask the question, what if they are wrong? Or for that matter, what if we are wrong? So let me go quickly through some of these items. I'm going to jump to, well, first, let me let you know the Florida Chamber Foundation is a business-led, visioning, and action-oriented think tank. We're nonpartisan. We do have a bias. It is not about a party, though. It is about free enterprise, not free market. It is a system that recognizes all three sectors. It recognizes the role of government and laws. And we are guided by something called the 6 pillars. I'm not going to spend tons of time on that. They are the things that we view as the engines driving communities forward that include talent, our innovative abilities, infrastructure, business climate, governance, and quality of life. And under that governance, we really do think very broadly about the independent sector. I do want to highlight, for those of you who do know the 6 pillars, I don't know how often you look at the top of the house, because that really is what drives me. And embedded in that is our vision for what we're trying to accomplish, and that is global competitiveness, prosperity for all Floridians, and ensuring vibrant and sustainable communities. We work on projects that are research-oriented. I want to thank Jack Levine for recognizing one of those earlier, the Business Alliance for Early Learning. A lot of folks don't know why the business community would be engaged with children, except for the fact that not only are they the future of Florida, but we're made up of individuals and people, by the way, who have those babies. So there's a lot of reasons why we would care about that. But we also do interesting convenings like this Prosperity Summit flyer that's on your desk. I'll talk a little bit more about that, and I highlight those items because I'm going to wrap that back into the overall movement. Mark Brewer yesterday made a comment about how the independent sector draws resources from the other 2 sectors to apply to problems. Did I get that right, Mark? So I want to dive back a little bit in that particular philosophy and really talk about why economic development is important. Building an economy is essential to solving problems, not necessarily because government gets more money, but because business gets more money. And here's why that's important, because you've got to take a deeper look. Every dollar that is applied to a problem actually comes from business and the marketplace, because government gets its dollars from what it extracts from other individuals who freely give it through the taxation process or corporate taxes. And then there are some dollars that are what you and I would apply to different problems. But where did we get that? Either from our jobs or from accumulated wealth. Look, at the way this system works is the money comes from our engagement in a marketplace. Yes, there are other systems across the globe, but this is the way that we're dealing with it in this problem. Now, I want to tie it to a second thing. These may seem very disjointed at the moment, but I'm going to bring them back together under a 5th point. We get something as business leaders out of civic engagement. You know, I will tie back to one of the biggest questions that we normally would hear when we survey businesses, and we survey them pretty regularly. A big challenge is the quality of workforce, the ability to make sure that people are connected and able to work in a setting. And I'll tell you what the biggest complaint is, and you probably hear this, whether if you have a child, if you were part of the labor force and heard this at some point in your life. Businesses complain about not having folks that can communicate or work in teams or critical thinking or problem solve. Ever heard those types of things? Well, guess what? Where do we learn those things? We learn those first in our homes or in our engagement as children, right? Executive functioning skills, or we learn them in the community level. There are a lot of things that we can teach in a business setting, but we really learn those in the places where we develop social capital and we learn how to either get along or not get along. The essential skills of empathy really do have a lot to do with everything from sales to entrepreneurship to teamwork to communications to moving things forward. 2 concepts so far: what we give in terms of dollars, what we get as employers. Let me talk about a natural experiment that's going out there. You may have heard that Amazon is looking for a second headquarter. And this has become the biggest conversation in economic development. And one of the interesting reasons is because a lot of times these things are secret. This one's actually out there in the public and said, here's the RFP. So what do we want? It's an important project. They're trying to build a second headquarters. It's going to be significant. They're going to hire 50,000 employees with an average wage of something close to 100,000 plus whenever it's fully operational. They're going to invest $5 billion in capital expenditures. Within whatever community it gets. It will be a game changer, and I don't care what size community you are. If you're huge or small, it will change the landscape to some degree for the very long term. The reason I bring it up is because in their RFP, there are things that they care about in terms of incentives and capacity within a community. But as you would expect out of Amazon, they also highlight things like a commitment to sustainability. And they highlight a cultural community fit, which includes things like preserving and supporting diverse populations and quality of life, where employees will enjoy living and engaging with each other. If you haven't figured it out, a big part of business is being in a community that we want to be in. Business leaders are part of the big picture. So I'm going to start tying these together and land this on the comments of economic development. So if you've been watching the legislative process, God bless you, first of all, for trying to do that. The second point is that you may have noticed a very big conversation over the last year that had to do with economic development and what the legislature was going to be either investing in or not investing in. The Speaker of the House now and the upcoming Speaker of the House talk about their visions. So we may call these political visions to some degree, but at the end of the day, aren't they the same types of visions that we're talking about here? You may be thinking about the legislature in a completely different setting, but they're representing voices. Like it or not, they are representing voices. I will speak to something that I heard Speaker-elect Oliva talk about. And I reference this because you'll hear this debate next year. Government has a role for not picking favorites. In this case, it's about not investing in certain types of business. I'm going to tie this back in, and let me just go ahead and lay this out right now. Are we picking our favorites in terms of civic engagement? It's a critical question that we have to start thinking about. What communities do we want? Second point that Speaker-elect Oliva said, if we are going to stand by the position that we're not going to give incentives, then we must make sure that everything else is absolutely peak. Now, that means infrastructure, that means schools, but that also means the community and the quality of life environment that we live in. So the Speaker of the House is basically saying, I'm willing not to invest in economic incentives, but I'm going to put it everywhere else. And you can't buy the types of things that we've been talking about in terms of civic engagement and the quality of life that's driven by these types of things. But we can drive it in one way or another. How do we get to it? Today, we are arguing about economic development at the legislative level, but I want to throw out that demographics comes into play here. And here I'm going to go back to something that Jim asked a little earlier. What are the people that are moving into Florida voting like? What are those patterns? And I'm bouncing around, but I promise I'm going to end with one more comment here that ties it all together. Tomorrow, the conversations may be about liberal or conservative ideas. They may be about topics or issues, but they are more likely to be about different perspectives, different wishes, and different needs. And the business environment, the economic development conversations, the things that are going to drive competitiveness and prosperity and vibrant and sustainable communities, the things that I talked about at the very beginning that we're trying to drive for at the Chamber Foundation, but what we've been talking about here are going to be influenced by how well our civic engagement is actually run. Why? We're adding 6 million more individuals, and you know very well that we tend to grow from the outside. So Jim, to your point, how do people vote? I really take my hat off to Jack Levine, who constantly reminds us that, yes, seniors will vote for the interests of children if we allow them to come into contact. However, we're moving into environments where people are not collaborating or colliding with each other. There aren't public spaces. There are enclaves. There are gated communities. There are whole communities that keep children out on purpose. And we are heading into an environment then where we will be roughly, just to say, a third young, a third middle, a third older. And we all have specific issues and needs. We will have, by the way, the interesting dynamic that the older sector will largely be white, and the younger sector is going to largely be brown. It will be different, and they will be unconnected. Our history in Florida has been that while we have been different in ages, we have been related in some way, somehow from the communities we've come in. Future demographics aren't pointing that direction. We're going to be alienated, and if we can't find a way to interact, if we cannot find a way to intersect with each other, collide and work together, co-labor, work together, co-labor. That's not just part of the word collaborate. It is a strategy for the future. Then we will fight constantly for things like pathways to hospitals and healthcare needs, and ignoring the needs, for example, of education and future issues, right? We will be looking to our own self-interests. And one of the things I know about voting is that under 18, we don't allow to vote, even though there have been some suggestions that we can do different strategies and stuff like that. So we will have populations that are unrelated, unconnected, not conversing to each other, with very different wishes and needs and objectives. We cannot rely on the models that we currently have today to carry us through these crises unless we have the engines that we're talking about here. I absolutely agree with Daniel, though, that we can't just keep talking to each other about these types of things. We have to take this out into the public. We have to take this out much broader, and we have to make it a lot less academic in nature. The folks that are in this room, hey, we're the elites. We've made it in this process. We've won this game, but there are people that can do this type of game and are doing this from the ground level. But I think we have some critical questions that we have to ask ourselves that really talk about how we share visions together, or at least understanding for each other. And I will tie back to something that the mayor said. Mayor Becker, thank you so much for highlighting not only that the business is a big engine for getting things done, but the only path forward is when we are all working together to some degree. I think that's where the power and the engines come. So let me throw out this last question. And I know that this might be a little bit, like Daniel was saying, a little controversial to some degree to throw out there, but it's an important element. If we care about communities and competitiveness and prosperity for all, then we must care about the community broadly that it's working in, the engines that are going to deliver the quality of life and the means for prosperity in a very difficult, disruptive times. And you and I believe that this democratic process, that this engagement, that this community conversation is absolutely the path. But what if we're wrong? In this conversation over the last 2 days, we haven't stopped to ask ourselves, what if they are wrong, but we are the they? Empiricism, when you look outside, basically says that people don't want to participate, that they're not engaging in democracy, that the chaos of politics is the norm of the day. Is that an acceptable path? Is that what we should accept? Now, a market solution might basically say, okay, if that's the way it works and there's a return on it, great. Let's go for it. But let me actually suggest that that's not what I'm advocating, nor is it any business person that I know. They are advocating for community and working together and engaging not only in creating citizens, but creating people who are connected to each other to survive the level of disruption and the community development that is needed to go here. Do we persist? Yes, we persist. Not because necessarily we know that we're right, but because we must believe that we're right. The processes that brought us here, the processes of this 200 and some year experiment is not only about democracy, it is also about a marketplace capitalistic. We each benefit and can retain something and carry forward, and with that, give back, not only to our families, but to our communities. So why does economic development matter in this conversation? Because when we build a community that provides wealth and paths to prosperities for individual, we have the means to take care of the problems that we want. Otherwise, all we have is our gripes and our complaints. So I'll summarize it this way. Economic development gives us something, we as communities get something from it, and each of us personally gains from it. Is this the only path? No. But I hope that you will understand that by inviting business to the table, listening to them with open ears and open hearts, we can accomplish these things. And I'll add, in case nobody asks, because there's an anxiousness to get out, business doesn't have to change the way it does things. Its value actually comes from the lane it plays in. You doing what you do and business doing what it does is where its greatest value is. When we work together, each of us working as either independent sector, as government, or private sector, and doing what we do best, we gain the most. So thank you for allowing me this final rant, but I appreciate the opportunity to continue the engagement of business and economic development in this civic conversation. So.